Like, could you imagine? How would I look my kids in the face and say, "Well, the reason we're not worshiping tomorrow is because the government told us not to"? Right? Like, that would be terrible. That would rip me apart on the inside. But God gives you the grace to do what you need to do in the moment.
Hi, I'm Evelyn Rae. Welcome to the Caldron Pool Show. Today, I am joined with Pastor Jacob Reaume. I hope I pronounced that right. I did ask him prior to the show. It's a real honor to have him here. He is a pastor in Canada. And I really wanted to get him on the show because, like us Aussies, we have a few bruises and battered insides from the last few years. I wanted to pick his brain. I wanted to hear from his experiences. And I know that many Australians and people around the world would really like to hear this as well. So I really want to thank you for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
Before we get started, are you able to give us a little bit of a background of who you are, where you're serving, and what you're currently doing with yourself?
I am the senior pastor at Trinity Bible Chapel in just north of Waterloo, Ontario. And so Waterloo it's a fairly large city in Ontario. We have just over 500,000 people between the two cities that combine together. We're just on the edge of the city. And I've been the pastor here since 2009. And I'm happily married with 6 kids.
Now that is an impressive resume, 6 children. God willing, we can all be so blessed as to have a full quiver like that. Now I'm guessing, especially because you are a husband and a father, and not only that, you're a father of a congregation as well, the last few years would have been challenging. Now, I've said it so many times on this podcast, how challenging it was for us Australians. And I think the world has kind of labeled Aussies as the most tyrannical nation in response to COVID. But to be fair, I think you and I probably have a fair fight here as to who had it worse, because Canada wasn't too far behind us, if not on par with us, and maybe even a little bit ahead of us. And I think it hit us in about March of 2020 when things started to get really interesting. Is that about when it hit Canada's sort of shores?
Yep, March 2020 is when the first lockdown happened here. And it's funny when you start comparing the two countries because your winter's ahead of ours. So I remember when things were going crazy in Australia in the winter, I guess it was our summer and your winter, and everyone's like, oh, I guess that's coming here. And we're just a few months behind the rest of you because that's when the lockdowns hit again.
Yeah, it was sort of like a script around the whole world, but I think, we were dubbed the prison colony because, well, we had the most lockdown city in the whole world of all time in history, modern history, which was the city of Melbourne. Now, back in March 2020 in Canada, first lockdown, was that the same as sort of us? It's just 2 weeks to flatten the curve and then things will go back to normal. Was that your understanding of it at the time?
That's right. We were told 2 weeks to flatten a curve. That's exactly what we were told. Same line.
And that didn't obviously happen for you guys. What did happen from that point?
I think after about 10 days, 9 days, 10 days, the narrative started to change, and it was something to do with save the healthcare system. And so it went from flatten the curve to something switched, and I noted the switch right away because then that's when I realized they were lying to us. When I saw that the narrative and what they were promising us was shifting.
And did you notice at the beginning of these lockdowns that the church was fairly gracious in how the government was responding? Because I've often said, I don't mind back in March 2020 when we didn't really know what COVID was and we didn't really understand it. I can understand there being grace towards our civil government and grace towards perhaps ministers and their response because, there was a lot of propaganda coming from China, a lot of videos of people foaming at the mouths and dropping on the streets, and you didn't really know what you were dealing with. But can you remember a certain time for you personally when you thought, okay, now is the time where we need to change our course of action in terms of how the church is responding to the government's demands with all of this?
Well, I was immediately critical of what the government was doing because I saw what it was going to do to small businesses and families, and I immediately recognized it was an intrusion on their civil rights, which are grounded in God's law. But I was willing to give them the benefit of the doubt. And I remember I illegally met with a group of guys for a prayer meeting. I think it was the first weekend we were shut down, and we were all like, yeah, this is a load of garbage. But and they're all saying, yeah, we're talking it through. And I'm like, well, let's give the government a shot. So they said 2 weeks to flatten the curve. If the narrative changes, we have to start doing something about it, because we know they're lying if the narrative changes. And then within three days of that meeting, we all prayed together for a good while. And within 3 days of that meeting, the narrative was changing, and we're all like, yeah, this is a load of nonsense, and these people are liars. And so at that point, I realized that it's gonna take a huge effort to build consensus in the church. But I started to build consensus with the people that I knew agreed with, were, this is wrong, and the church needs to gather, and then started to work outside of that circle and try to build consensus within leadership. But within about 10 days, I knew it was a load of bunk. I knew it was, I believed it was wrong immediately, because I knew what the government was doing to private property was theft, and the sense that they were taking over private property. But I thought, maybe we ought to give them a little bit of deference. I wish I hadn't thought that, but even my last sermon in the church, it was pretty clear that the lockdown was coming. And I warned the church in that sermon. I said, do not trust the government. I mean, these are people that say that a boy can be a girl. So they're not honest people. But we did give them deference. Yes. Regrettably.
Yeah. Hindsight, if you could bottle it up and sell it, you'd be a millionaire, right?
Right.
Yeah, I think totally. And that's, I guess, time does eventually reveal truths. And sometimes you can have a lot of discernment about things, and you can see trajectories. We had a lot of ministers over here who said a lot of really good things early on, who said a lot of things similar to what you were saying about, the government aren't your friends, be careful of what you're hearing. But as soon as the church in Australia as a whole, not all ministers obviously, but collectively I'd say majority, as soon as push came to shove and the government did encroach on the church's sphere of authority, they kind of caved in pretty easy. There wasn't much resistance or anything like that. But there were some incredible ministers. I was mentioning this to you before we went on record here, but there were some amazing ministers who saw the trajectory similar to you, who very early on said, this is not good, and this is going to end here. And they were criticized for having that, I guess, discernment, and for speaking about things that hadn't happened yet. But in the end, they were vindicated, and they were right. Every single warning that they gave their congregation and everybody else turned out to be true. Now, did you see a lot of ministers in a similar position where they were saying the same things as you and warning their congregation about what the government are doing? Or were you kind of like the ministers in Australia, where there were few and far between?
I had some friends in Ontario who were sympathetic towards what I was saying as far as ministers go, and we drew closer together over time. And then there was a couple other brothers that began to speak out very early on also. But we were kind of like mind before this went down, and then there's a couple more that we connected with after it went down. But I want to say that there were two friends for sure, and then I made some more actions as things progressed, that we realized that this was a load of just nonsense. So yeah, in Ontario, and then we developed friendships across the entire country as people started getting fined and going to jail and stuff. And then that's when I lost a bunch of friends, but I gained a bunch of friends too.
I was just about to mention that it was quite divisive in the church, but at the same time, it was also quite uniting in brotherhood and sisterhood as well, because it really did sort of sort the wheat from the chaff, and it really kind of made you reflect on, I guess, who you're investing time in, who you're giving that to. I personally lost a lot of friends and even family over the decision to not get vaccinated and things like that. And that was really heartbreaking at the time. But in hindsight, again, I'm grateful that, God's kind of showed me where my time should be more wisely spent, perhaps. Now, I wanted to, you mentioned obviously that ministers were fined and went to prison and things like that. We didn't have anyone in Australia, as far as I'm aware, go to prison. We were watching that happen from here over there, and it was truly shocking, to be honest, to see. I mean, it shouldn't be shocking for Christians. If you look throughout history, this isn't a new thing. The early church especially had, brothers have their heads cut off and, burnt at the stake, all kinds of things for this type of thing. But persecution to such degree in modern church, I would say we've had it pretty good compared to people in the past. So this was shocking for me, seeing it, and especially seeing ministers being arrested in front of their children. That was quite horrific, to be honest, to say the least. Mm-hmm. It really was. Now, what led up to that? I want to get into that, but how did that come to be? So what at the time was the government telling the church to do, and what did these particular ministers decide, I guess, not to do to lead to this?
So the two notable brothers who were thrown in jail are in a different province than me. So I'm in Ontario, and we didn't have any ministers thrown in jail. We had property seized and millions of dollars in fines, and contempt of court charges, and this type of stuff. But they were from Alberta, and I think they had a prohibition on gathering. They might have had a complete prohibition on gathering. I'm not exactly sure, but it seems like what happened then was things ramped up in their province. Then they ramped up in our province. Then they started trying to figure out how we're going to deal with these pastors. And then our church was in the spotlight nationally for, I don't know, 2 or 3 weeks. They went after us really hard with a contempt of court charge, and we ended up with a $120,000 fine that we had to pay. And then once they went after us, they started throwing the guys in jail out west. And then the spotlight was on them for a while, and then it came back on us at Easter time when they seized our building. So that was in, I want to say January. Yeah, it was in January of 2021 when we got our first contempt charge. And then once that was done, we were off the radar for a little bit. Things opened up again here within a couple of weeks, and then those guys were thrown in jail.
Yeah, wow. So you mentioned that your church had contempt and things like that, and fines, and you had your building seized. Can you talk me through all of that? Because I've seen a lot of things, but I'd really like to hear how that played out. What you guys had to do as a church did you have to go to court and fight that? And where are you currently at with all of that now?
Yeah, we've spent more time in court than I'd like to. So I don't know how many hours. And well, I wouldn't say in court. It's been Zoom court. So if you want to call that court, I think it's a bit of a mockery of our justice system when the judge is dealing with people behind a camera and doesn't even have to look at us in the eyes. But that's another story. But we've spent a lot of time in Zoom court, and yeah, it was the first fine. So they came after us with fines, and I think every fine against the church is a maximum of $1 million, and then every fine against me personally is a maximum of 100,000, and every fine against one of our elders is a maximum of 100,000. So every Sunday the cops would show up and give me $100,000 fine, and give the elders $100,000 fine, and give the church $1 million fine. And then this wasn't working, and then so we got a court order against us. And the judge said, if you open your church again, you're going to get charged with contempt of court. We opened the church, we got charged with contempt of court. And then that was a $120,000 fine that we had to pay up front, whereas all these other fines are still before the courts. We haven't dealt with them yet. We hope to deal with them this fall. So I got 1.2 million against me, and the church has 60 million, and each elder that was an elder at the time has about 500, 600, 700,000 against him max. And wow. And so those are still hanging over our head. But the contempt stuff was pretty real because we were in court right away. And that was wild because the first Sunday that we met and it was illegal, the cops did a perimeter around our church, and they were all over the place. But it's amazing. There was one officer, and this is in the court documents. This is quite the story. There was one officer who was parked in our driveway or our parking lot, and he was doing surveillance of us. And he was told to go in and press charge against me personally. I don't know whether he's told to arrest me or he was told to give me a ticket. I don't know what it was, but he was told to press charges against me personally. He refused because he's a Christian, and he got sent home and he was charged.
Oh, wow.
So, which is quite something else. And I think that might have thrown them off a little bit because then they left and they left us alone. But then they came back the next Sunday for more, and the next Sunday for more. And then what the first week that we were charged, they never gave us any charges that week. But Wednesday night came, and I thought they were just going to come for me. And so the cops, we had 5 or 6 cop cars outside my house on that Wednesday night, and they started pounding on my door. And I just looked at my wife. I said, "This is the cops. There's no way I'm answering them. I'm not answering them. I don't care. They can leave." And so they all left, and they called me on my cell phone, and I just ignored them, and they all left. And then I find out that they've scattered throughout the community, and they're now at each one of our elders' doors. So I felt like a bit of an idiot because I didn't answer the door. And then when I didn't answer the door, they went after all of our elders and started and ticketed them. I still think they had all their tickets ready, but they weren't expecting them. I was expecting them, and I thought that they would just hit me, but they hit every one of us. And so you got to really hand it to our board, because we were all thrown off balance a little bit, because the expectation that was that I would be the target. And then they made a target of every one of our elders. And the tactic, I think, was to cow each one of us and to divide our board. But they were not successful in that. Our board is still united. We love each other more than we've ever loved each other. We trust each other more than we've ever trusted each other. And we have zero regrets. So the first night that we got the ticket, the next night the elders got together, and we had an elders meeting at the church. And I don't know what your viewing audience or listening audience is going to think about this, but I brought in a whole bunch of beers, and I toasted to the fact that we were all charged and that we were persecuted for righteousness' sake. And we had a bit of a celebration and some laughs, and had a good elders meeting. And then we're like, "Yep, we'll meet again next week." And so we met again the next week, and things kept going until the contempt charge, at which point we ducked out for a little bit and went somewhat dark while meeting in our church parking lot. And then we went back to, things opened up a couple of weeks after that, which is when the first brother was arrested out west.
Mm. Yeah, wow. I mean, I don't know how you stayed so, I do know how you stayed so cool and calm and collected with all of that, because you have Christ, and like he says, pick up your cross and follow me. So we have to almost find the joy in persecution, because we must be doing something right when that happens. But I must.
But you think about it. No, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go.
Well, I was just going to say, like, you think about, the people in the church are watching you, the people in the community are watching you, my own children are watching me. And I'm thinking, I want these people to know that Jesus is worth it. Like, that's what's going through your mind. And then you're thinking, the Lord is now branding me. He's branding us as worthy to suffer for the name in a small way, right? We weren't martyred or beheaded or anything like that, but it was quite the honor.
And I think it's amazing that you have that perspective, because I don't think many modern Christians do. And I think it's because we are so removed from the physical sort of persecution that the older church suffered before us. Like we have had it relatively easy. It's almost like we've had a miniature form of Christendom. And we've rejected God and we've become so godless. So we're kind of undoing the good that the initial Christendom did. But it didn't come easy for our brothers of the old church, it came at a large cost. And I think we've lost sight of that. And so, I think it was almost probably in the West. I mean, you've got brothers and sisters in China and the Middle East and all other types of countries that have faced a lot of persecution recently. But for us in the West, I would almost say this was one of the first moments where we could truly be tested and measured, and put, I guess, what we say into practice, into tangible, real life practice. We all say the right things. We all say, of course, if like Peter, like, of course I'm not going to deny Christ. Of course I'm not going to do this. But in reality, I think that we're a lot weaker than we lack a lot of humility, I think, in things. And so, yeah, I really am encouraged by the faith that that you guys showed, and all the other ministers who stood up against Caesar. It was very encouraging. And I think courage is infectious. It is a disease that I would be happy to be a pandemic and spread around the globe, courage culture. So it was good. And like you said, people were watching and looking, and that's important. And so I just want to encourage you that it did a lot of good for even people in Australia. So I thank you for that. But I'm amazed that you all stuck together, because that's those moments where they come after other people, where you think it, divide and conquer. It's written in the Bible. It's the old play book. And so the fact that they could not divide you guys is a testament to,
I think it shocked the media and it shocked the authorities, because the media was all over us, and the authorities were all like, they were doing everything they could to intimidate us. And we can, at some point in this conversation, we can talk about what happened that fall. So that's the winter, but what happened that fall is quite astounding, as to our relationship with the local police and whatnot. But it's just, as James says, you resist the devil and he flees from you. So
Amen. Yeah. Now, can I ask, just to clarify something, how is it that they found out who the elders were at the church? Is that something that's on like the website or something? Did they go like investigating to try and find out that information?
In order to register as a not-for-profit in Canada, the government has a list of the directors.
Right. Yep. I think that's pretty similar to us over here.
Right. So you just have to go on the federal government website for the Canada Revenue Agency, and it's all there.
Yeah, right. Like I was saying, I think that we've lived with such government overreach and just seen it as normal for so long.
That's right.
All of the things have been in place for such a long time that they could use it when they need it. It's just we've been at the mercy of them for however long, and they haven't used it. But the powers, the structures of our organizations, it's been there the whole time. So
yep, there was another generation that let this come in, and that's on them. But no, we have to deal with it. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's what I hope that we do, because I don't want our children to have to be the ones to deal with it. If we don't take this stand now, they're going to have to, because like Doug Wilson has said, stupidity can't sustain itself. At some point, it's going to implode. And I don't want that to be on my children's shoulders or backs. I would like to take the hit for them, essentially. So I think it's important, not to forget what happened only last year and go, whew, that's over. Now we can just move on. It's like, no, we have work to do to make sure this doesn't happen again, and undo all of the things that previous generations let in with their, I guess, complacency or apathy or lack of understanding of the freedoms that were given to them by their forefathers, I guess.
That's right.
But I've often said Australia is very different to America, because we were founded as a penal colony. So we have had a very different relationship with the government than Americans. The Puritans kind of saw, I guess, the overreach that the state was having in the church. They weren't happy. They fled. They went to America. They built a nation. They had to fight for their freedom to sort of separate themselves from that. And so their pillars of civilization, I guess, how they built theirs is very different. We came out here as a second chance. Thank you, the government. The government was like our God. The government was like our parents. That's kind of why they treat us like children now, because that's how we were raised in this country. And so that we value security over freedom over here. Would you say that that's similar in Canada, or because you're a little bit closer, would you say that you're a little bit more Americanized? I'm not too sure on the cultural thing with Canada with that.
Well, Canada historically or Canada presently are two different things. So, I mean, our independence from the United Kingdom was won after a series of violent uprisings and a fight for almost a Republican type government. And the uprising stopped, but the vision was ultimately successful in 1867. And so the whole idea was the Canadian people wanted responsible government, and we got it. But unfortunately, that responsible government was lost 100 years later, and now it's just been a greased rails to hell ever since. So and there's a number of things that play into that are from, there's the multiculturalism aspect, and there's mass immigration, and there's the dumbing down of the public education system. There's the forgetting of our biblical roots, forgetting of our history. But But certainly at this point in time, I think the God of Canada, for the most part, the Canadian people, is the government. Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's well, you've got, theonomy, and then you've got democracy, and theos, God, demos, the people, which is the state. It's inevitable. 51% doesn't mean something is right, and I think we've lived that way for
That's
a bit
right.
too long, to be honest.
That's right.
And yeah, I think that demos turns into statism, and I think that's, yeah, definitely the state. I think wherever your authority comes from and your highest court is usually where your God lies, and that is our Supreme Court, which is very godless, unfortunately. So yeah, I think we're seeing the fruits of a godless system at the moment. That's what we're reaping. And
Well, it's interesting. So we've launched a series of constitutional appeals against our government for what they've done to us. And so we've lost the first two rounds of the appeal, and now we're waiting to hear whether the Supreme Court will hear from us. But on
okay.
both rounds of appeal, so the two lower courts, the ruling against us, the judges have unanimously said that in this time of crisis, they need to give deference to the state. So it's not deference to the individual or the rights of the individual, but it was deference to the state. And essentially, in the ruling, the court understood that the government might not have acted properly, and admits that our rights were violated. But essentially, if you want to boil it, and I'm not exaggerating, because I've had lawyers read over my understanding that I've put on paper, and they've said, yes, you're right. It's essentially, people were scared. The government did something. At least they did something.
Right. So basically, the state, the court system, is offering grace to the government for their decision making, but they're not offering the same sort of grace for how you responded to their decision making.
That's absolutely right. So in essence, the Constitution is designed to protect the people from the state. It's supposed to be our shield against the government. But now what that Constitution is doing is it's the shield of the government against the people. So there's no legal recourse, or no avenue of legal recourse within that branch of government, the judicial branch of government, to rectify the wrongs that were done against us.
You see, a system without justice is very godless, because, the civil government is meant to wield the sword of justice. It's meant to correct the wrongs, and it's meant to punish the bad, and it's meant to do good for the people who do good. And it just seems so incredibly backwards. You've had your rights violated, it's acknowledged, but there's no justice for you. And I think, yeah, a system without justice is a system that is a beast in itself, a very dangerous precedent to set. Like history shows, when the government takes something, they very rarely give it back. And if this is a new legal precedent that they're going to set, that the government can essentially get away with things and there's no legal ramifications or repercussions, that's very dangerous for our future.
One of the things, though, that I've believed is we've acted in the way that we have, and the government has reacted to us in the way that they have, is the further the government takes it, the quicker they're inviting the judgment of God upon them. So I think, as Christians, and you know this, is our ultimate recourse and our ultimate hope is not in our government, nor is it in our judiciary, but it's in God Himself, who hears the cries of His people. And so we sing imprecatory psalms and pray imprecatory prayers regularly as a church. And I certainly believe that our government is, by the way they have acted, they've lost the blessing and favor of God, and they are inviting terrible judgments from heaven. And unless they change course, they will see that they will receive those judgments, and the people will fear.
Absolutely. You only have to read the Old Testament to see what happens when God turns His back on people. And it happens time and time again. You see, even with the Israelites, whenever they turn and they become godless and they worship idols, at some point He turns His back on them and judgment comes, and then He sends a prophet, and then He redeems them. And it's this story from the beginning of time, and we can thankfully look at that and see that. And I guess take comfort that ultimately, even if the civil government fails, no one can get past God and His sovereign will. And
or even the New Testament. If you look at what what enraged the Pharisees during the Passion Week? It was the children
Mm.
singing praises to Jesus in the temple.
Yeah.
And right, and 37 years later, those people were killed by Roman armies, and literally
Yeah.
hundreds of them crucified in the city of Jerusalem, and their temple was burned to the ground.
Mm.
And that was God's judgment upon those people. And so what did the government come down on us for, and why have they dragged me through the mud and caused me all this stress and try to destroy our church? Because we were singing praises to Jesus like the children in the temple.
Yeah, that's a very good parallel. Very, very accurate parallel. I think, John Calvin once said that when God wants to judge a nation, he gives them bad leaders.
Mhm.
And I think that I do think that we are under God's judgment in many ways in the West,
Oh,
because
most definitely.
we've humiliated him long enough. We've dismembered babies in the womb in the name of healthcare. We've cut off
Mhm.
genitals in the name of tolerance. And we've essentially mocked him for long enough. And so it's inevitable. And I definitely think we're living under it for sure. But I would like to get into, you mentioned the fall in Canada, something that happened in the fall after all these sort of fines and seizing of your church and all those sorts of things. Can you elaborate on that a little bit further?
So what happened in around Easter time? We did the unthinkable, and we kept meeting for church, and then they charged us with convicted us of contempt of court again, and then they stole our building from us. And then we met outside for the summertime, and we started going back to court, I think in about July. And when we went back to court, the judge was like, well, we'll give you your building back if you agree to abide by COVID protocols. And we have a school that we run. And so they knew they had that leverage over our head because our school facilities were shut down. We have a fairly sizable classical Christian school. But the elders wouldn't budge. And they kept saying, no, we are not promising you that we are going to abide by COVID policies. We're not doing it. We're not doing it. No. And then we go to court. No, we're not doing it. No. And then finally, at the end of the summer, the Crown prosecutors just basically said, okay, you can have back. And so they gave it back to us, and we were back in the building. The school started just on time. And right after that is when these vaccine mandates started coming.
Mhm.
And so we had a vaccine information night. So I spoke at it. I gave a theological justification for conscientious objection, right? Your own health over your own health decisions and so on. And then we had a lawyer there who explained kind of the employment aspect of this. And we had someone from the Liberty Coalition Canada there. And then we did a Q&A afterwards. Well, the local cops were going through this vaccine mandate then too. And our church for this thing was way beyond capacity. I mean, I'm not saying that we broke COVID code, but I'm not even going to say we didn't break fire code that night. But that's not an admission on the air, by the way. I'm not saying we didn't. But the but it was packed to the gills. And so many people in the community came in, people from the hospitals and so on. And so the cops were getting calls about our church that night. But the funny thing is some of their colleagues were in our church listening to the presentation. And so one of the cops got a call, and he called someone who was in our church, who was another cop who was listening to the presentation. And he says, yeah, I got a call. I'm supposed to do a checkup on Trinity Bible Chapel. He says, but the only way I'm coming in that building is if I sit in and I take in the presentation. So it got to the point where the cops would get calls about us. And I think my understanding is this happened fairly regularly, and they just refused to visit us. And it all just stopped. Like, we were basically in violation of all the COVID mandates for the fall of 2021, right through long past the trucker convoy. We were under a court order. So we actually had a court order on us so they could get us a contempt of court any Sunday. But they just completely left us alone. And I don't know why they left us alone, other than the scriptures tell us, if you resist the devil, he will flee from you. And so, man, we resisted, and we took a beating from the media, and we took a beating from people in the community, and we had threats on us, and from the police and the courts, and it went on and on and on and on. It was exhausting. But eventually it just all stopped. The laws didn't change. the government policy didn't change, but the cops just lost the will to leave us alone. Like back in the spring of 2021, it was so bad that they had 10 cop cars, I think, lined up outside our church, and they knew they wouldn't stop us from going to church. So what they would do is they would go and they would chase people down the road after they left church and ticket them. And there was a young guy in our church who thought it'd be a good time. Like, I don't know, do you do kilometers or miles down there in Australia? Is it
We do
kilometers?
kilometers. Yep.
Okay, so you're like us, you do kilometers. So a guy in the church figured it'd be a good idea to, like, he had this little sports car, a little Honda Civic that was all souped up, and he ripped down the road. It's an 80, and he ripped down the road doing about a buck 50, and he wanted to see if the cops would chase him, and they wouldn't, because our parishioners who were worshiping during COVID times were more dangerous. So, but then the men in the church started to leave. So this is you'll like this story. It might make you laugh, but it's funny. So the men in our church caught wind of what was going on, and what they would do is they would leave the church parking lot ahead of a whole crowd of people. Like, there's single moms at our church. Like, they don't need cops bugging them and this kind of nonsense. This is the only place they could go and act normal during COVID. And so the guys in our church would leave, they'd jet down the highway or the road, and they'd let the cops trail them. And so they'd be a decoy. And then everyone else could leave. And they would sit on the side of the road, and the policeman would be like, "Can I see your driver's license?" And there's a video of a guy doing it. He'd go through his wallet and he'd go through every card and say, "That's not my driver's license," and spend like 5 seconds, and then put it down, and then do that again and again, just so he could stall them, right? And this went on over and over, and then finally the cops just left, and they let. And the really funny thing is that Sunday was the Sunday the judge really dropped the hammer on us. But they didn't know it. That night we met back at the church for a potluck, and the cops never even knew that we were doing it. So we look back at this, and we tell stories, and we laugh, and we almost fall off the chair laughing over how much fun it was. And it was a lot of fun. And the guys in the church had so much fun coming up with security on how to deal with the police. And, it was a good time. But eventually, yeah, they just left us alone. And that was it. Nothing changed as far as government policy, but the police just left us alone. Everyone in the community knew what we were doing, and they were still complaining because they were trashing us on the internet, and they were calling the police on us, but they left us alone.
That's so interesting. Yeah, we were so much more compliant over here in Australia. Like, we really were. Like, we just didn't have anything like that. And a part of me has that, I want that camaraderie. It feels like you built up that kind of camaraderie with your congregation. You see all these, I don't know if you watch the TV series Survivor, they put 40 people on an island for 40 days. And by the end of it, they're all best friends and they've never known each other. And it's because when you go through something with somebody, you do build a camaraderie and you build this weird sort of bond with each other. And I feel like you guys really got that as a church, going through this together and building those friendships and fellowship through the hard times. So it's probably made you a lot stronger coming out the other end of it as a congregation, I'm guessing.
Well, the church had to deal with some internal conflict in the spring of 2020, and that bonded us together. And then coming out of that, the COVID lockdowns and the dealing with the police and the media bonded us together. And so I feel like the Lord used it to train a generation of elders, like,
Yeah.
and leaders, right? Like, there's a core at the church that is as tight as anything. So, and it is a really, yeah, we have a really good time together.
That's great.
There's a lot of new people that have come, and we're getting to know them. But this group that kind of carried the ball through that season, it's a really, we get along quite well.
That's great. It's encouraging. Now, you mentioned that in Alberta, there was obviously, it wasn't just done through way of monetary fines and contempt of court and things. There were actual ministers and things that were sent to prison. Now, I'm guessing you've spoken to them, like you have a relationship with them as well. Are you able to share a little bit about their story and what happened with them in terms of that?
As far as what happened to them, or as far as the relationship, or
Yeah, just what happened with them, like how they ended up in prison. And I guess perhaps if you know, like why they weren't just slapped with fines, like what the difference was there.
it's different policy. And
Right.
so their government decided to use a different policy with him. We all thought that I would go to jail, and there was Saturday nights, several of them, where I sat my wife and kids down and say, okay, if I go to jail, here's the contact. And we had a list. If all the elders go to jail, here's who's in charge of the church, this
Mm.
man. And if this man goes to jail, this is the next one. And so this was all organized. We had a dossier on it. So our kids were all ready from it. And in fact, one of my daughters wrote me a letter. I still have it. And she said to me, Daddy, I'm proud of you. And if you go to jail, I know you're doing it for Jesus. Right. And so
Wow.
these were the conversations we were having. We all thought I would, and we were all ready to. Every one of the elders was, but the guys out west were the ones that went to jail, and that was
Mm.
in God's providence, and that was part of the plan, I guess, of the Lord. So
Mm.
it's interesting how that worked out, because we had, like, Ontario, where I live, is a more social, like, it's more socialistic, it's more Marxist, I guess you could say, um, and Alberta is more freedom centered,
Mm.
um, they call it Texas North sometimes. So
Okay.
it was a little surprising that their government was as hard on them as they were. I was a little shocked, but they were, and that was part of God's plan, I guess.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, it was very confronting, like I mentioned, when they were getting arrested in front of their children. And even just hearing you then talk about like your daughter writing you a letter. Like I just can't imagine um how that would feel as a father and as a husband to have to sit down and have that conversation with your family. I like just the emotional part of it. It sounded like, you were all on the same page, and praise God that you obviously all love Jesus and you're willing to sacrifice everything for him how it should be. But I just can't imagine having, my husband sit me down and talk to me and my kids about, honey, I might be in prison and you're going to have to be on your own with the kids for a while. Like, I just can't imagine how that would feel, and how that would feel as a parent to have to. Was that incredibly, like, obviously you speak about it now and everyone understands, but was that really difficult for you as a husband and as a father having to do that?
No, God gives you grace in the moment, and I think it would have been
Mm.
more difficult if we cowed. Like, could you
Yeah,
imagine, how
okay.
would I look at my kids in the face and say, "Oh, the
Mm.
reason we're not worshiping tomorrow is because the government told us not to."
Mm.
Right? Like, that would be terrible. That would rip me apart on the inside. But God gives you the grace to do what you need to do in the moment.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I guess that's part the difference of being a man and a woman, and in
Mhm.
God's goodness, he made us different that way. And I guess as a father and as a husband, you are the head of the home, of the covenantal family. And
Well, there's a
that's
difference between being a man and a woman, yeah. But I mean, my wife was all for it too, right? Like,
mm,
she would have been, to her, it would have been dreadful if we compromised. And
mm,
there was never a moment where she was like, "Honey, do you think you should do this?" She's like, "You you,
mm,
you have to do this."
yeah.
And I think that's actually consistent with all the men in Canada that have been seriously, reprimanded legally.
Yeah.
I mean, every one of their wives, as they all know each other, and they're all very
Mm,
much the same way. It's like, I just couldn't, they couldn't imagine the fact that we would do otherwise, and they
mm.
would, they wouldn't, they wouldn't want it that way.
Yeah, that's amazing.
It
I
was hard,
really,
but yeah.
yeah, really encouraged by it. I think it's
Hmm.
you're right. It'd be more. You'd hate yourself, wouldn't you, if you
Hmm.
cowered, and your children saw you as that.
You'd
And I think
lose
it
the you
would.
lose the power of God, and it would be so
Mm,
shameful to be on that side of things. And I just thank God that we weren't, right? I mean,
mm,
it doesn't just, and you're fearful of, when the next thing comes down the pipe, you don't want to be the person that's on the side of cowardice.
mm,
Because just because we were faithful this time doesn't mean we'll be faithful next time. And so
mm.
we have to keep looking to the Lord Jesus.
Absolutely. And you don't, I guess you don't want to desensitize your children to not obeying God's laws and commands as well.
Mhm.
So I think if you do compromise or cower, then you make it easier for them to do so in their own lives in the future as
Mhm.
well. So, yeah.
Mhm.
And I guess that'll lead me into my next sort of thing I wanted to talk to you about. You made a documentary, and I'm guessing you made this after, like, post COVID era, and I watched it. You I'm grateful you gave it to me to watch, and it was really well done. It was, and you're not a filmmaker, like you mentioned, you're a pastor, but you did this, and I would love for you to tell people what it is and what it's about, if you don't mind.
The documentary is called Antichrist and His Ruin, Church at War, and it's named after one of John Bunyan's later works, which was called Antichrist and His Ruin. And and so what and I think Bunyan in that book presents a really helpful understanding of what Antichrist is. So
Mm.
one of the things that we were at a disadvantage with going into COVID is some of the sensationalized teachings that we've received on Antichrist over the last, I don't know, half century.
Mm.
And they've been more marketed to sell books or produce flashy material
Movies.
and foster, yeah, your imagination, get it all
Yeah.
going. And so we were at a disadvantage because we didn't have biblical concept of Antichrist. And I think Bunyan really captures what Antichrist is and how to deal with Antichrist and that essentially is when the spirit of Satan or the power of Satan takes over the mechanisms of state and church. So it takes on it embodies human institutions and people and so on. And so Bunyan was exposed to that, and it was what Bunyan's editor, George Ofer, he says that Antichrist will change his form, but never his intentions.
Mm.
And so it's, of course, in Bunyan's time, the Antichrist was the Church of Rome taking over the levers of government in England, and then attempting to force the clergy to comply with Roman liturgy. And that was his goal. It's always to control the church. It's the crown jewel of Jesus. And so, but now it's not the Church of Rome, it's these health mandates. But it's amazing how it's always, Antichrist always sees his government. He never sees his government and he's like, and government comes out and says, I really want to hurt people. It's always like, no, it's the Church of Rome. We're here to worship. And what's wrong with a little bit of a vestment and a liturgy and a crucifix in front of your church? And right. And we're here to help people with their health, right? It's all these their words are they are smooth as oil, but there's daggers in their hearts, as the psalmist says. And that's Antichrist. It's the spirit of darkness embodying itself in institutions. And in this case, it's the government, the church. And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to draw some parallels between Bunyan's time and our time, which I did. And then I wanted to explore our history as Canadians and where our rights came from. And our rights came from Bunyan's time because there was a generation of ministers and Christians that resisted. And an answer to their prayer was the Glorious Revolution that brought in civil liberties for Protestants. And we inherited those as Canadians. And so I wanted to draw that parallel and then explain what happened to our once great country and why we find ourselves in the sorry state that we are right now, where right is wrong and wrong is right, and up is down and down is up. And, beauty is ugly and ugly is beauty, right? And so this is where we are as Canadians. How did we get here? Because this is not the country that my grandparents lived in. And this is not the country that my great-grandparents lived in. And so what happened to this once beautiful country? And frankly, it's not the country I grew up in. I'm only 41, but it's not the country I grew up in. It's disgusting what's happened to this place.
Yeah.
And then I wanted to just, and I close it off with a message of hope. So how are we going to fight against this beast? And talk about that.
It was a really good documentary, how you did it, how it told a story. And something that I was amazed by is the parallels between what Bunyan went through and what we were put through during COVID. Because, you think of Bunyan and you think of his some of his famous works, and he's well known for things. But I feel like this part of him is perhaps not as well known as it should be, and just how strikingly similar a position he was put in, like we were as well. and I went through the in your documentary, I think it was Cobb, the person who was interviewing him, who tried,
Right.
Bunyan was in prison and he came in and he tried to plead with him, and all he had to do was sign something to say he's not going to preach in public. Or you have to just sign this and you can be free. And I think there were even conditions then that were then added on, or you can do this, but it just has to be done this way. And it's just and I think it was also, only for a short time. Like, it wasn't forever.
Right.
It was for a period of time. And, Cobb used Romans 13 and told him to obey Caesar, the king, like we're commanded to. And I just could not believe just the parallels between what ministers are being faced with, because that was the number one argument that I heard in Australia was Romans 13. We have to obey the civil government. And I read this, I don't know if you've read the book, it's called Caesar and the Church, and it's by Anthony Forsyth, and he wrote it in response to it. But it's a really short book, it's really good. But he basically says, to understand Romans 13, you need to read what precedes that, Romans 12, and you need to read what authority actually means in godly terms. And to do that, then you can understand Romans 13, that all authority is delegated by God and limited. And each sphere of authority has those limitations. And I could not believe how many people get Romans 13 wrong. It really put that on display.
They do get it wrong. And one interesting note about Bunyan is they didn't have a problem with his message, because Cobb even said to him, you can share your message in private. But the issue that they got Bunyan on was gathering crowds, because when they first arrested him, Charles II had them under an emergency order because there was someone who'd attempted to overthrow the government. And so people were terrified, like we were, right? Like, everyone's scared. Someone's going to overthrow the government. Got to protect the government. And so Bunyan was charged with having an illegal church service because he was gathering crowds, and Cobb went after this. Stop gathering crowds. All you have to do is stop gathering crowds. You can talk to people as individuals, just don't gather crowds. And then they had their gathering limits, and we had our gathering limits. And you're absolutely right. People have they've completely perverted Romans 13, but this is not the first generation to pervert Romans 13, because there were many people in Bunyan's generation who perverted it too.
I think it was in the documentary, there was, I think, was it the Conventicle Act, which came in, which was it more than 6 people, I think?
I think that's what it was. Yeah. The Conventicles Act. Yeah. So what happened was the ministers were chased out of their parishes. And then what happened was the people in their parishes that wanted to hear their message would still gather with them privately. And the government wanted to crack down on that. So they passed the Conventicles Act, and a conventicle was an unlicensed religious gathering, and you couldn't have more than 6 people in your home. And so the government cracked down on that. Yeah. And so Bunyan went to jail before the Conventicles Act. Yes. He was the first Puritan to go to jail, but that came in after he was arrested. And that's what got a number of the other Puritans in trouble. It was the Conventicles Act.
History repeats itself, doesn't it?
That's right. Yeah.
It's crazy. It's just like this was what, in the 1600s?
60s and so on. So, I mean, Bunyan died in the 1680s, 1688, I think is when he died. So it does. But it shows you, like, there's patterns in history. Satan always has the same plan, right? He wants to control the church, and he's going to get his minions in charge of government. He's going to get his minions in charge of the church. And he's done that successfully in this country. In your country, he's done that.
Yeah.
And so this is an ancient war that we're fighting, and it goes back a long time, right? You see it in the birth of Christ, with King Herod wanting the Messiah dead and his parents having to flee to Egypt, right? And it's Satan's up to the same game back then by trying to control the instruments of state.
Absolutely. And you would hope that we would learn from history, but we seem to make the same mistakes. We almost lose sight of it. But this was really helpful for me, watching this documentary and seeing the history. And like I mentioned before, I just couldn't believe. I was like, wow, that's the exact. It's like our governments in 2020 read all the history of the 1600s and go, we're going to do exactly that. It's like, that's how you know it's Satan. It's the same evil. It's the same beast, so to speak. And you mentioned in the documentary that the Antichrist is the lawless one. That it is he that is opposed to God and opposed to the law. So, we're sort of portrayed as the lawless ones right now. We're portrayed as the ones who are breaking the laws when really we're not. It's the Antichrist who rejects and hates the laws, and it's the Antichrist who is in fact the lawless one.
Right. We're like the people in the book of Esther, where it was noted Esther's people are a people who abide by their own law. And we abide by our own law. And it's not lawlessness, it's the law of the creator. It's our government that is creating up and making things. I mean, we're just abiding by the same laws that our ancestors did, but the government's making stuff up on its whim by the really the power of Satan to, and it all goes together, right? It's whether it's the COVID lockdowns or it's the blasphemous attempt to declare that two men can get married. There's the government belching out blasphemies, or the attempt to say that a boy can be a girl or a girl could be a boy. So the government's defining marriage, the government's defining gender, the government's claiming to be able to control the environment, the government's claiming to control disease. All this stuff goes together, and it's all the government taking on the role and attribute, or claiming the role and attribute of Christ.
And you also mentioned in the documentary, which I found really powerful, how you said Christ is king. And we say that all the time, and I say that all the time, Christ is king. I think a lot of modern Christians don't fully understand the implications of that. It's like a nice little word, but really, and you mentioned it, that we've lost almost how political that is, to declare one king over everything and over all. Yeah, Christ is king, and he crushed the serpent's head, and this is his kingdom. And now we are, I'm hoping we're going to create Christendom 2.0. That would be, that's what we're working towards. But, you mentioned before that you went into a little bit of hope at the end of the documentary, something like, that help us to move forward past this. Are you able to go into a little bit of that for us now?
Well, we need to have hope in our Lord, so you think about what Bunyan went through and all the terror that his generation suffered, and what did it produce? Well, it produced the glorious revolution with William of Orange crossing the Channel, driving out James II, and ushering in a time of freedom that whether you're in Australia or Canada or England or even the United States, have benefited from that revolution that occurred in 1688, which was a direct answer, I think, to the Puritans' prayers as they were suffering under the tyranny of Charles II and James. And so this is what we need to do. We need to be faithful, because when we're faithful and the government comes down on us, the government is inviting God's wrath upon themselves, and God hears our cries. And what we are building, which is, precious metals, and it's not wood, hay, and stubble. These are the things that will last. All around us in my area, there's churches that are going up for sale. There's congregations that are divided. There's businesses that are falling apart, and there's families that are falling apart. This is all a result of, it's all what COVID exposed was the weak foundation that so much was built on. But what is surviving and what is flourishing? Every one of the churches, for the most part, there's a few exceptions, but every one of the churches, for the most part, in Canada that resisted and received a significant amount of persecution are thriving. I don't know. We have baptisms now every Sunday of people who have genuine professions of faith. Pretty well. There's some Sundays we don't, but typically, I think we've got 3 this Sunday, and I don't know. They're on a regular basis. So, and these are people who are receiving the knowledge of salvation and coming to Christ and believing in him, and their lives are being changed. And it's not because we're preaching a soft, artificial gospel. Like, it's a gospel of repentance I'm preaching. But what has survived in this country and what is flourishing, pretty well the only thing that's flourishing are the churches that did stand, which is quite something else. Everything else seems to be it was built on sinking sand. But when the storm comes, that proves what you were actually built on. And I'm thankful that we passed that test and we're able to show that we were built on the rock that is Jesus Christ.
Definitely. I think that things that are rooted in things like eternal things are going to withstand the earthquake and not fall off the shelves. And
That's right.
I think that, yeah, there is hope. Like I've seen it here, like churches start up as a result of them not being happy with how the church responded. So there is a new era of shepherds that are being lifted up and called to the position. I think that much of ministry, modern ministry, has unfortunately become academia. It's very, here's a career, as opposed to God calling men into positions. And I think this last few years, even in Australia, has seen God call up men into positions where there is a need. And those churches are absolutely thriving, similar to what you're seeing. But I'll just finish up by asking what it's been like post-COVID. We're getting a lot of talk over here from our churches asking for amnesty. But it's come without repentance, and it's come without sort of an acknowledgement that there was wrong. Are you finding a similar sort of trend in Canada as well?
I think so. I've lost contact with a lot of people that were on the other side of this, unfortunately. But certainly the Gospel Coalition Canada has just they've lost, I think, pretty well all their influence. And the only way they're surviving now is because a few of the pastors who are on it their churches continue to give a bit of money to the organization. But that's my theory anyway. They don't have many people at their conferences anymore, and there's not many people checking interacting with their website. But I think that the rift is there, and I don't think the rift is going to be healed unless there is repentance. How can it be? Right? Like, there was so much sin that was done. I'm preaching right now a series on the 10 Commandments. And I think I could argue pretty persuasively that the church is violated on a regular basis and advocated for the violation on a regular basis of each one of the 10 Commandments, every one of them, for the duration of those lockdowns, and preached it like it was gospel. So that's very serious sin. They're in violation of both tables of the law. And so there has to be repentance. And that's the only way that the power of God can be restored, and the Spirit of God will come in and dwell as people again.
Yeah, it's often very difficult for people, once they've made a mistake, to admit that they get something wrong. And something that I'm seeing a lot of is, instead of, I guess, humility and, I have got this wrong, a lot of people dig their heels in even firmer than before, in order to not have to, I guess, be personally responsible. But, we do pray for them. I do, because, God can soften a stone heart when he wants, and if he wants, and that's my prayer. But no, I'm really encouraged by the stand that you took in Canada and other ministers over there. It is very encouraging. And I hope as the church moves forward in Canada, it can be one that bears good fruit. That's my hope for Australia as well, that we have learnt from this, that we don't regress back into this spot. But I'd love for people in Australia, and anyone else who's listening, to access your documentary and watch it. I think it would be incredibly helpful. So are you able to point in the direction of where people can go to access that?
Antichristdocumentary.com is the website, antichristdocumentary.com. And so on the website, you can pay to stream it, or you can pay to get a DVD, and we'll ship a DVD to you. But most people like to stream it. So some people still like the DVDs, but most people like to stream. So antichristdocumentary.com.
Amazing.
And I think if people watch the trailer, just watch the trailer, then I think that'll sell you on the documentary, because I think it's a good trailer. That's my opinion.
It is. It is a very good trailer. And I actually might link it, if that's okay with you here.
Yeah.
People can watch it and do it, because it was really good. And it's a really high quality documentary. I'm very impressed. You're not a documentary filmmaker, but perhaps this is another calling you could look into, because it was really well done.
Well, I'm not going to take credit. I'm not going to take credit for the quality. I'll take credit for the ideas. I can sell ideas, but I don't do video. I don't do technology. I can barely fire up my computer, but I know a guy who does. And he did a very good job. Jeremy Bundy. I'll have to give him a big shout out.
Well,
I have a hard enough time. I have a hard enough time working my phone. So
it's probably not a bad thing, to be honest. It's
Yeah,
nice.
but Jeremy Bundy is he's a very good producer and marketer. So, but antichristdocumentary.com is where you can find it. Thank you for the advertisement.
Mm.
Shout out for that. Yeah.
No, it was really good. I feel better for watching it for sure. And yeah, thanks again for joining me today and for giving, your version of events and testimony and experiences. It's very humbling because I'm thinking maybe you have perhaps earned the brownie, in the movie. Where Julia Roberts has to fight for her brownie and she has to say that she's had it worse off, and whoever's had it worse off, Notting Hill, gets the brownie. I think you win the brownie today because I don't think we
But honestly,
experience
I don't feel like
that.
we did have it worse off, because to me, COVID was fun. Like it was the suffering. No, but seriously, the suffering was
Yeah.
terrible. What people had to go through, and it's that was not fun, and it's dreadful. It's horrifying what the government subjected the people to. But the experience of church was like it was we experienced the manifest presence of God in a way that I cannot describe. And everyone that came to the first Sunday where we were in contempt of court will tell you that. And that's when the salvation started coming. Like, we've had probably hundreds of baptisms now where people will stand in the tank and they'll say, I was saved as a result of hearing the sermon on that Sunday. I came to church on that Sunday. I heard about the church open on that Sunday. My friend told me about the church on that Sunday, and I heard about Christ and repented. And it's like it just, God unleash and open up the heavens for a time of revival.
It's
That
amazing.
so yes, we had to pay a price, which was some bad press, but has the reward has far surpassed the price that we've had to pay. And it's really been a lot of fun. It
That's
really has. There's been a
amazing.
few stressful times, but it's been a lot of fun.
I think that's an amazing spot to finish on, and I hope people feel encouraged by that, and that they can, go into their own churches and try and sanctify themselves and the elders, and perhaps, if we're faced with something like this again, which I hope we're not, but we probably will be, we can have some of the courage that you had over in Canada as well. So thanks so much for joining me. It's been a real blessing. And yeah, I hope everybody goes and watches that documentary, shares it with their friends, gets everyone to watch it. It's really important and encouraging as well.
Thank you, Evelyn.